So I saw some spooky movies. It's Halloween or somewhere close to it when this video is published. Let's talk about some spooky movies. One film I saw was Barbarian. The general consensus around this film is that you'll either absolutely love it or absolutely hate it. So with me obviously only existing to be contrarian and not having any real opinions, I'm somewhere in the middle. Honestly though, this movie had some strong elements and some weak elements. I absolutely love the concept for this film and I respect it quite a lot, but in execution, not all of it worked. It's very difficult to talk about this movie without spoiling it, so here's the spoiler warning. If you want to skip the spoilers, just skip to the next chapter in the YouTube video, and I'll talk about the other movie. So essentially, this movie is broken into three very distinct acts. Act 1 feels like a straightforward, cliched modern horror film. Act 2 flips the film on its head and gives a subversive comedy. And Act 3 returns to horror, but it's kind of a different style. There's a creature element that wasn't exactly expressed in the first act of the film. They retain a sprinkle of the comedy bits from Act 2, and there is a mild action element to it as well. I absolutely love and respect what this film set out to do, but the only really strong act in this film was the second, and that makes sense as the director, Zach Kreger, seems to have more of a comedy background than horror. Zach is one of the members of the comedy group known as The Whitest Kids You Know, and they've made some very hilarious and iconic sketch comedy over the years. When this movie is funny, it is very funny, and I wish I felt that strongly over the horror scenes. The first act of this film is way too pedestrian and familiar, and the music in Act 1 was way too insistent. It was doing a lot of the heavy lifting with the tone, and it was a bit overbearing. I liked some aspects about the look of this film, and it was not poorly shot by any means, but I found it a bit difficult to truly experience the intended emotions for this portion of the film. The entire first act does feel like it is building to something else, so if the horror elements in Act 3 were stronger, then perhaps it would be more forgivable, but it still wasn't scary. The creature design choices were something that might have worked better if they just showed less of it, because seeing the full face just really wasn't scary or convincing. The execution of the creature felt like something that should have been in Tim and Eric's bedtime stories, except despite the second act of this film, it doesn't feel as though we're supposed to treat it as a joke in the third act. Sure, there are comedic elements in the third act, but the music is insisting a very serious tone. The impression I get from the film is that we're still supposed to fear for the characters' lives. There are jump scares where the implication seems to be that we're supposed to be frightened. If it was not trying to be scary at all in the third act, then it did not communicate that very well. And if it was trying to be scary, then it was not very effective at all. Regardless of whether or not I was actually scared by it, these sections felt way too cliched and by the books. If I'm not going to be scared by it, then it should at least be fun, but it was way too familiar for me to feel any real excitement. It was sketch comedy level in its execution without the entertainment value of it being a real sketch comedy, which is why I love the second act of this film so much, is because it does function as a comedy. It is clearly where the film's strengths are, and the way it's executed is fantastic. Justin Long was absolutely hilarious. I should point out that he was in another horror comedy called Drag Me to Hell, directed by Sam Raimi, but in Drag Me to Hell, both the comedy and horror elements were incredibly strong. Please check that one out, it's awesome. Overall, Barbarian is a film that I really respect for what it tried to do. I love the concept, but I really wish its first and third act were more polished in execution. A good amount of this film was fun and enjoyable, and even the weak sections weren't absolutely atrocious. I would recommend this movie, and it was worth watching overall, so check this one out if you want, and I'm giving this one a 5 out of 10. Another film I watched was the new Hellraiser, and to prepare for it, I rewatched the original. I had already seen the original Hellraiser, written and directed by Clive Barker, when I was 15 or something, and it did not really leave a huge impression on me at all. I was kind of bored and confused, and I didn't wind up remembering all that much about it, so rewatching it was like a fresh new experience for me. Now that I've experienced the film again, I can confidently say that I'm still not really that into it, but there are a few elements to this film that surprisingly hold up. There is a lot of gore in this film, and the makeup is really well done. There are some really cool looking prosthetics. The makeup is something that they clearly put a lot of effort into, and it really paid off. I also like that the movie gets into the creepy shit right away and doesn't waste any time. This film also feels very unique. The sequence of events is absolutely bizarre, and its pacing and structure are so weird. The Cenobites don't even show up until close to the end of the film, and I understand they're not supposed to because they weren't originally conceived as these villain characters, and some might not even even call them villains at all. They just follow the rules of the box thing. It's kind of confusing, but they're not really villains, and maybe a Hellraiser nerd can explain it a bit better in the comments section. Anyway, this movie has a lot of unique and interesting choices, especially in the way that it's structured. A lot of it feels very much like a kink movie. It's very strange. It is definitely enjoyable and worth watching, despite much of it being cheesy and ridiculous. The whole last 10 minutes of the movie was pretty bad. It felt really thrown together. But yeah, check it out if you want. It's bizarre. 5 out of 10, I guess. The new Hellraiser is directed by David Bruckner, and it features the same writers that worked with him on 2020's The Night House. I would consider myself to be a fan of David Bruckner, and although I haven't absolutely loved everything he's ever made, I've always connected with it. Everything he makes is something that I always respect. There's always intelligent and creative choices that I appreciate, and this film is no exception. I don't think I've been this into a horror movie in quite a long time. This was a very refreshing experience for me, and I found myself getting what I've wanted out of horror movies for so long. I absolutely love the way that characters were treated in this film. They were surprisingly humanized and realistic. It has been so long since I've actually cared about characters in a horror movie. So many horror movies are afraid to create genuine, empathetic characters. There's this idea that the character should be as unlikable as possible so that when they die, you're like, hell yeah, kill this bitch. But this movie instead has you empathizing with its characters, and I love that they did that. When the characters are in danger, I'm having a real emotional reaction to the scene. I'm thinking, no, shit, I'm actually worried. I don't want these bad things to happen to them. That is a true horror experience. And in so many of these other films where they continue to have nothing but unlikable characters, they waste time going through the motions of pretending to develop them anyway. So oftentimes my experience watching those films is, oh my god, get on with it, just kill them already. So many horror films are boring and frustrating because of this. So many horror films don't care about its characters because a large amount of audiences don't want to feel bad when someone dies. A lot of horror fans don't really want to experience real emotion. There's a large amount of audiences that want nothing more than blood and gore and jump scares. And we can see this reflected in box office numbers. And if that's what you like, that's okay. You are not a worse human being because you have different preferences. But personally, so many films just feel cowardly because they're too afraid to show you real emotions. There are characters in this film that barely even spoke, and when they died a horrific death, I felt bad. That's great. This film is both cruel and empathetic, and I love it for that. The film's handling of topics like drug abuse felt very mature and genuine. It handled it so much better than so many other films that have tried to do the same. Most of the performances in this film were great. The main actor did a really great job, and she felt like an actual person rather than a character in a horror movie. Her brother, who is an actor from 13 Reasons Why, not so great. His presence on screen didn't feel all that convincing, and he felt very much like an actor. His character is in a gay relationship in this film, and although I appreciate that that was there, it felt very artificial. There's something about it that just felt like this weird stereotypical version of a gay couple that only exists in movies. And I can speak confidently about this because I personally know every gay you're watching right now. Seriously though, it felt kinda off and kinda fake and pretty underdeveloped. Their relationship did have a purpose in the story, and it really paid off as the film went along. Honestly, the majority of my criticisms with this film are all probably within the first half hour. The opening scene was probably the weakest point in the film, and although there were some nice looking shots, the music was really overbearing. Even past the opening scene, the film's score feels like weirdly intense modern trailer music. I'm really glad it toned itself down by the end of the film, but yeah, that first third of the movie, the music was a little much. I forgot to mention the music was really fantastic in the original Hellraiser. It was really well composed and performed, and I loved it. It was also really funny because I immediately recognized it from some classic internet videos back in the day. Someone known as Gazora made some really funny mashup videos of Star Trek The Next Generation. They got removed from YouTube back in the day, but somebody re-uploaded them, so please check out this playlist because they are very funny. Anyway, back to Hellraiser 2022. Something that I really loved about this film is that it cared whether or not things were justified. There are events and character actions that on a reductive surface level could be found found in any other horror movie, but unlike so many other horror movies, these events and character actions are actually justified. Rather than having a cheap plot convenience take place just to get us from point A to point B, it comes up with good excuses for these things to take place. It feels so refreshing to watch these things happen and be like, yeah, that is actually what would happen in that scenario. I can see why that happened. It doesn't feel completely out of nowhere. It doesn't feel cynically thrown into the film with no respect for its audience. Now, this film is definitely not a remake of the original. It is a reimagination of the franchise, so you shouldn't expect this film to be consistent with the others. The Cenobites in this film have a bit more agency and intent than the other films, if I understand correctly, so they do wind up being more villain-type characters than they were in the first films. I've only seen the original and not its sequels, so if someone wants to explain in the comments, please be my guest. Either way, they have a lot more presence in this film than they did the original. They definitely change who these characters are and how they're used to different degrees, but it doesn't feel inappropriate because this movie is not working with the same timeline as the original films. This film is intent on being its own thing, and the choices that they made for this film do feel justified. For the story that they're telling, it really works. So while I understand that some diehard fans of the original feel betrayed by this, it doesn't really feel like any kind of an issue to me. The Cenobites in this film were actually scary to me, and I didn't really feel that way in the original. Still, it is clear that this film is made with love for the originals, even if it decided to reimagine some aspects for the story it wanted to tell. With what it did wind up showing, I actually wanted a lot more out of it by the time the film was over. And this isn't really a complaint against the film, I just found it so interesting, and this film made me really curious about the lore. I wanted to know what happens if they do this, or what if they chose that option. I'm glad it didn't show everything because I really enjoy thinking about it and discussing it with people. Who knows, maybe I'll watch some of the old sequels. The fact that this movie got me interested in doing that as a possibility is more than the first one did. There were sequences in this film that were just so incredibly creative and effective. I guess I'll go into spoiler talk now because I want to talk about them. Spoilers now. When the roommate character is injured in the back of the vehicle as they're driving, I fucking love how this was presented. The fantasy horror elements are so well communicated by showing this through her perspective. So many other horror films would just have her simply disappear or wake up in this other environment and they'd be like, where'd she go? But the fact that we're able to see her slowly leave into another realm from her perspective is just so existentially terrifying. It is like a nightmare watching this happen, and I love that they showed it. The effect looks so great and it is conceptually terrifying. On top of that, when they start torturing her and we get that interior throat shot, that was awesome. I love the extra detail of the sound design in this sequence, how her scream gets muffled as the camera perspective is inside her. There are some really cool and creative choices in this film. I was still able to appreciate the visceral torture and gore while simultaneously caring about the character and feeling bad for her. You don't have to choose one or the other, you can do both. I also absolutely loved the ending of this film. It is not entirely happy and consequence-free, it is not entirely bleak and depressing, it is somewhere in between, and I love that it's morally nuanced. It is a true horror that she's going to feel guilt and regret over the rest of her life for this decision she's made, even though by all accounts she probably made the right one. The fact that they don't reveal what would have happened if she chose otherwise is such an intelligent choice. She might have survived, but it's going to eat at her the rest of her life, and that is a great choice for the film. I love that this film cares about emotions and it cares about consequences for the characters. It doesn't just fart things out, it actually cares. So yeah, obviously I love this movie. It has a bit of a rough start compared to the rest of it, but this was a genuinely refreshing horror experience for me. I was disappointed, to say the least, when I found out after watching the film that not a huge amount of people are connecting with it in the same way that I do. Meanwhile, Smile is doing terrifically. Apparently what I want out of horror films is not exactly the same as what a lot of other people want. So it is kind of depressing because I want films like this to be successful. I want more horror films that care about its characters, please. Anyway, please check this one out on Hulu and help reward films like this for existing. I did a full live reaction to it on the YMS Watch-Alongs channel that you can check out right now if you want. You can experience the film with me and see which parts I loved and which parts I didn't in real time. Anyway, please check it out. I really loved this movie, and I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. Thank you. Jogo, I thought that you guys were like trolling. There's literally an article headline
I think
that says
they're
Resident Evil
not
producers
trolling.
says Village was balanced based on feedback that Resident Evil 7 was too scary. Like, really though?
I legit believe it. I mean, based on what I've seen from this game, I believe it. What do you think?
Okay, this is from
What do you say? What do you think?
VideoGamesChronicle.com.